Jason's backpack hit the ground with a thud, but the pain in his chest was far worse. Had he really just been expelled just because he was a farmer's son? Principal Carter's cold words echoed in his head. This school is for respectable families. You don't belong here. Holding back tears, Jason walked home, dreading the look on his parents' faces. But the next day, as a Billionaire's helicopter roared over the school, every single student and teacher froze in shock. Jason's fingers curled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening. 6 months of pre-dawn mornings, helping his father with chores before studying past midnight. Perfect grades. Top test scores. None of it mattered. My grades are the highest in my class, Jason said, his voice barely steady. I earned my place here. Principal Carter's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Grades alone aren't sufficient, I'm afraid. Westbridge Academy maintains certain standards. Our families expect a particular caliber of student. His gaze flicked meaningfully to Jason's worn sneakers, the faint smell of soil that clung to him despite his best efforts. You simply don't fit. The whispers started then, rippling through the gathering crowd. Jason caught fragments, knew he didn't belong, finally getting rid of him, smells like manure. His face burned, shame and rage battling for dominance. The office door swung open, and 2 security guards stepped inside. Jason's stomach twisted as realization dawned. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was an expulsion. Please escort Mr. Miller from the premises, Principal Carter instructed, already turning away, dismissing Jason from his thoughts as easily as he dismissed him from school. Rough hands gripped Jason's arms. As they marched him down the corridor, students parted like water, some averting their eyes, others watching with undisguised curiosity or satisfaction. Near the lockers stood Mason Reynolds, heir to Reynolds Industries, his designer clothes and perfect haircut embodying everything Jason was not. Guess the charity case experiment finally ended, Mason called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Back to shoveling manure, farm boy. Jason locked eyes with him, swallowing the bitter retort that rose in his throat. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing him break. Inside, though, something was crumbling, not just his dreams of education, but his belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. By the time he reached the school gates, the security guard's grip had loosened, but the invisible weight on his shoulders had only grown heavier. Looking back at Westbridge's imposing stone facade, he wondered how he'd ever believe someone like him could belong there. The long walk home stretched before him, each step carrying him further from the future he'd worked so hard to build. How would he tell his parents? What would he say? That despite everything they'd sacrificed, despite all his efforts, he'd been deemed unworthy simply because of who he was? A bitter laugh escaped him. All those nights studying by lamplight, all those mornings with soil under his fingernails and textbooks propped against the tractor. For nothing. Because no matter how smart you were, no matter how hard you worked, some doors remained firmly closed to farm boys like Jason Miller. By the time Jason reached the gravel driveway of his family's farmhouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field his ancestors had tilled for generations. His parents were already waiting on the porch, their expressions shifting from concern to dismay as they read the defeat in his posture. They expelled me, Jason said, the words barely making it past the lump in his throat. His mother gasped, covering her mouth with soil-roughened hands. But your grades weren't enough. Jason dropped his backpack onto the weathered porch boards. Principal Carter said the school is for respectable families, not for people like us. His father's weathered face hardened, years of fighting drought and market prices having taught him to mask pain with stoicism. But Jason could see the hurt in his eyes, the silent acknowledgement that this was a battle even Benjamin Miller couldn't fight. Come inside, his father said finally, placing a calloused hand on Jason's shoulder. Your mother made stew. The kitchen, with its faded curtains and the ancient oak table scarred by decades of family meals, should have felt comforting. Instead, it only emphasized everything Westbridge Academy had deemed insufficient about him. The silence as they ate was punctuated only by the scrape of spoons against bowls and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. There are other schools, his mother offered eventually, her voice too bright. Maybe the public high school in town. It's not the same, Mom. Jason pushed his half-eaten stew away. Westbridge opens doors. Their graduates get into Ivy League colleges. They have connections. He swallowed hard. I thought if I worked hard enough, none of the rest would matter. His father set down his spoon, studying Jason with eyes that had seen too many seasons of both harvest and hardship. There was a time, he said slowly, when I worked for a man who believed talent mattered more than background. Samuel Kingston, brilliant mind, started with nothing, built an empire. Jason had heard fragments of this story before. His father's brief time working on an experimental agricultural project for a company that later became an industry giant. Kingston saw potential in people others overlooked, his father continued. But men like him are rare, son. Most of the world, it judges books by their covers. So, I'm just supposed to accept it? Jason's voice cracked. That no matter how hard I work, doors will always close because I'm a farmer's son? His father's eyes held a mixture of pride and sorrow. No, you fight, but you choose your battlefields wisely. That night, lying in his childhood bed, Jason stared at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars he'd placed years ago still faintly shone. The familiar creaks of the old farmhouse, the distant sounds of night animals, all of it felt both comforting and confining. He thought of Mason Reynolds' smug face, of Principal Carter's dismissive gaze. Anger burned in his chest, but beneath it lay something deeper, a gnawing fear that perhaps they were right. Perhaps there was a natural order to things, and he had been foolish to challenge it. I just wish, he whispered to the darkness, that someone powerful enough would see me, really see me. Outside his window, the vast night sky stretched endlessly, stars scattered like impossible dreams. In the distance, an unusual sound gradually penetrated his consciousness, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades cutting through the air. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until the entire house seemed to vibrate with its force. Jason sat up, heart suddenly racing. No aircraft ever flew this low over their property. He rushed to the window just as a blinding spotlight swept across the farmyard, illuminating the weathered barn and the rusted tractor his father had been meaning to repair. Jason! His father's voice called from downstairs. Come down here. Now. Pulling on a t-shirt, Jason raced down the creaking stairs, nearly colliding with his mother in the hallway. Her face was pale, eyes wide with confusion. Benjamin, what's happening? She asked as they hurried toward the front door, where his father stood silhouetted against the porch light. The thunderous roar outside was deafening now. As Jason stepped onto the porch, his breath caught in his throat. There, descending onto their fallow east field, was a sleek black helicopter, its powerful downdraft bending the tall grass in violent waves. But it wasn't just any helicopter. Even in the dim evening light, Jason could make out the distinctive logo emblazoned on its side, a stylized K that was recognized worldwide. Kingston Enterprises. The entire school stood frozen as the helicopter's powerful blades sent waves of dust and debris swirling across Westbridge Academy's immaculate lawn. Students shielded their faces, designer clothes billowing, perfectly styled hair whipping wildly in the artificial wind. Phones emerged from pockets like flowers after rain, recording what was undoubtedly the most dramatic event in the school's state history. Principal Carter pushed through the gathering crowd, his tailored suit collecting dust, his carefully cultivated authority diminishing with each step toward the unexpected intrusion. His face contorted with a mixture of outrage and barely concealed anxiety. "This is private property," he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the deafening roar. "Who authorized this landing?" "Security." But the security guards hung back, intimidated by the sheer audacity of the intrusion. The helicopter settled onto the pristine lawn, its skids pressing into ground typically forbidden to student footsteps. The school's flag fluttered violently in the downdraft, as if saluting the arrival of a higher power. Among the students, Reactions varied wildly. Some pressed forward eagerly, recognizing the distinctive black and silver aircraft with its iconic logo. Others retreated, suddenly uncertain in the face of an authority that transcended school hierarchy. Mason Reynolds stood with his usual crowd of privileged friends, his customary smirk faltering as he squinted at the helicopter. "Is that Kingston Enterprises?" someone whispered, the name rippling through the crowd like electricity. The agricultural conglomerate? Not just agriculture, technology, pharmaceuticals, real estate. They're worth billions. The blades slowed gradually. Their threatening were diminishing to a dull thrum, then silence. In that moment of anticipation, the school collectively held its breath. Even Principal Carter seemed momentarily paralyzed, his administrative playbook offering no protocol for billionaire invasions. The helicopter door swung open with deliberate slowness, the hydraulic hiss audible in the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the campus. A polished black shoe appeared first, then the immaculately tailored leg of a charcoal suit. The man who stepped fully into view carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never needed to demand respect. It simply arrived before he did. Samuel Kingston stood tall against the afternoon sun, his silver-streaked dark hair unruffled despite the helicopter journey. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the crowd with practiced efficiency. He removed his sunglasses with a deliberate gesture, folding them precisely before sliding them into his breast pocket. Behind him, two men in equally impeccable suits emerged, their expressions professionally neutral, tablets and phones at the ready. Principal Carter seemed to regain his composure, adjusting his tie and plastering a strained smile across his face as he stepped forward. "Mr. Kingston," he said, his voice pitched to convey both authority and deference, a balance he failed to achieve. "This is certainly unexpected. Had your office contacted us about your visit, we would have prepared a more appropriate welcome." Kingston didn't immediately acknowledge him. Instead, his gaze continued to move methodically across the faces of students and faculty, as if searching for something specific. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Principal Carter cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in my office? I'm sure whatever brings you to Westbridge Academy." "I'm here for Jason Miller." Kingston finally spoke, his voice carrying effortlessly across the lawn without seeming raised. The name hit the crowd like a physical force. Whispers erupted immediately. "The farm boy, the one who got expelled yesterday? Why would Samuel Kingston care about him?" Principal Carter's smile faltered, confusion briefly overriding his professional mask. "Jason Miller? I'm afraid there must be some mistake. Mr. Miller is no longer enrolled at Westbridge Academy." Kingston's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "I'm aware of that," he said. "That's precisely why I'm here." Mason Reynolds pushed forward slightly, his confidence visibly diminishing, but his curiosity overwhelming his caution. "Sir," he called out, "Jason Miller was expelled for good reason. He didn't belong here. This school has standards." Kingston's gaze shifted to Mason, and the words died in the boy's throat. It wasn't anger in the billionaire's eyes. It was something worse. Complete dismissal, as if Mason had suddenly ceased to exist. "Young man," Kingston said quietly, yet somehow everyone heard. "In my experience, those who are quickest to define where others belong rarely know their own place in the world." Mason stepped back, face flushing crimson as snickers rippled through the crowd. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he found himself on the receiving end of public humiliation. Principal Carter intervened, desperate to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Kingston, while we value your interest in our institution, I must insist we discuss this matter privately. Student disciplinary actions are confidential." "There's nothing to discuss," Kingston interrupted, checking his watch, a subtle but unmistakable power move. "I've already spoken with Jason Miller. Now I'm here to address an injustice." The word injustice hung in the air, challenging the very foundation of Westbridge's carefully constructed image of fairness and meritocracy. Students exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others intrigued by the unfolding drama. An injustice? Principal Carter repeated, his voice rising slightly. I assure you, all disciplinary actions at Westbridge Academy follow strict protocols approved by our board. Mr. Miller's case was handled according to established procedures. Kingston smiled, a small, knowing expression that never reached his eyes. Then you won't mind if we review those procedures together. Publicly, with the board present. He turned to one of his assistants. Call the board members. All of them. Now. The assistant nodded, already typing on his tablet. Principal Carter's face paled visibly. That won't be necessary, he said quickly. Perhaps we've been hasty. Administrative errors occasionally occur, even in the best institutions. Kingston didn't respond immediately. He simply watched as Carter's composure continued to crumble under his steady gaze. Around them, students and teachers remained transfixed, witnessing the dismantling of authority structures they had previously considered absolute. Tell me, Principal Carter, Kingston finally said, his voice carrying across the now silent lawn, do you believe education is a privilege for the few or an opportunity for the worthy? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and in that moment, everyone present understood that something fundamental was about to change at Westbridge Academy. Jason felt suspended between worlds as the helicopter descended onto his family's fallow field, the powerful downdraft flattening the wild grasses his father had left to seed. The machine settled with a gentle bounce, its blades gradually slowing but never fully stopping, as if its pilot knew this would be a brief visit. For several heartbeats, the Miller family stood frozen on their weathered porch, the evening light casting long shadows across their faces. Jason's mother gripped his father's arm so tightly her knuckles whitened. His father stood unnaturally straight, a posture Jason had seen only at funerals and bank meetings. Benjamin, his mother whispered, is that who I think it is? Before his father could answer, the helicopter door swung open. The man who emerged moved with deliberate precision, each step calibrated to convey authority without haste. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Samuel Kingston. His presence was as unmistakable as his silhouette against the fading daylight. Two assistants flanked him as he approached, tablets in hand, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings with professional vigilance. Kingston walked the uneven path to the farmhouse without hesitation, as though the transition from marble corporate floors to dirt pathways required no adjustment. Jason's father stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of his family, a subtle, instinctive gesture of protection. Mr. Kingston, he said, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. This is unexpected. Kingston stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at the family. His gaze lingered on Jason's father, something unreadable passing between the two men. Benjamin Miller, Kingston said, not as a question, but as recognition. It's been, 15 years? 17, sir. Kingston nodded, as if filing away the correction. The drought-resistant wheat project. You were one of our field researchers. A flicker of surprise crossed Jason's father's face. You remember that? I remember everyone who contributes something of value. Kingston's attention shifted to Jason, studying him with the same intensity he might apply to a complex business proposal. And you must be Jason. Jason swallowed hard, suddenly acutely aware of his faded t-shirt and worn jeans. Yes, sir. Kingston ascended the porch steps, the wood creaking beneath his polished shoes. Up close, Jason could see the fine details of the man's appearance. The precision-cut silver hair, the subtle texture of his custom suit, the watch that probably cost more than their entire farm. I understand you were expelled from Westbridge Academy yesterday, Kingston said without preamble. The blunt statement sent a fresh wave of shame through Jason. He glanced at his parents, wondering how much they had already told this man and why. Yes, sir, he admitted, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. Tell me what happened. It wasn't a request. Jason hesitated, looking to his father, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. Principal Carter said I didn't belong there, Jason began, each word still bitter on his tongue. That the school is for students from respectable families, not for farm boys. He paused, fighting to keep his voice steady. My grades were perfect. I never caused trouble. But it didn't matter. Kingston listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Jason finished, the billionaire turned slightly, surveying the modest farmhouse, the aging barn, the fields stretching toward the horizon. And this is where you work? He asked, though it clearly wasn't really a question. Yes, sir. Before and after school. Weekends too, when needed. Kingston nodded, then turned to one of his assistants. Give me everything on Westbridge Academy. Board members, financial records, disciplinary history. I want to know who's been expelled in the last 5 years and why. The assistant nodded, fingers already flying across his tablet. Jason's mother stepped forward, maternal concern overriding her intimidation. Mr. Kingston, may I ask why you're involving yourself in our son's situation? Kingston considered her question, his gaze thoughtful. Mrs. Miller, do you know what the most valuable resource in the world is? She blinked, caught off guard. I suppose many would say oil, or perhaps water these days. Potential, Kingston corrected. Human potential. It's squandered every day because of prejudice, systemic barriers, and small-minded people in positions of power. He turned back to Jason. Your son has potential. Principal Carter couldn't see past his own biases to recognize it. I find that unacceptable. Jason's father cleared his throat. We appreciate your concern, sir, but this isn't about concern, Benjamin. Kingston interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. This is about principle, and perhaps a debt. A debt. Jason's father frowned. Kingston's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Your research on drought-resistant wheat variants. The modifications you suggested to our initial formula. They became the foundation of our agricultural division's most successful product line. Jason watched his father's face register surprise, then confusion. But that was just field work. I was just doing my job. You were doing more than your job. You were innovating, thinking beyond your assigned tasks. Kingston turned to Jason. Like father, like son, I suspect. A strange tension filled the air, something unspoken passing between the two men that Jason couldn't fully decipher. His father seemed to be wrestling with something, emotions crossing his weathered face in quick succession. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Kingston? His father finally asked. Kingston turned to Jason. Get dressed. Something presentable if you have it. You're coming with me. Jason's heart lurched. Where? Back to Westbridge Academy. We have unfinished business there. Jason's mother stepped forward, protective instinct overriding her awe. Mr. Kingston, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Jason is just 17. We can't simply let him. Martha, his father interrupted gently. Let him explain. Kingston nodded slightly, acknowledging the concern. Mrs. Miller, I understand your hesitation, but I'm not just taking your son to confront his former school. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm offering him an opportunity, the kind that comes rarely in life. What kind of opportunity? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kingston's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jason saw something beyond the calculated business persona, a flash of genuine purpose. The opportunity to rewrite the rules, Kingston said simply, to prove that talent and determination matter more than background or social status. He glanced at his watch. But first, we need to correct an injustice. We leave in 10 minutes. Jason looked at his parents, silently seeking guidance. His mother's face was etched with worry, but his father's expression had transformed. There was something there Jason rarely saw, a fierce, burning hope. Go change, his father said quietly. Your good shirt is hanging in the closet. As Jason turned to go inside, Kingston called after him. Jason. He paused at the doorway. Yes, sir. Pack a bag as well. A few days' worth of clothes. Jason's pulse quickened. A few days. Kingston's expression remained impassive. This won't be a short lesson. As Jason hurried upstairs, his mind racing with possibilities and questions, he could hear the low murmur of adult voices on the porch below. His life had been upended twice in 24 hours, first by expulsion, now by this unexpected intervention. He pulled his one good shirt from the closet, The blue button-down his mother had insisted on buying despite its cost. Whatever was happening, whatever Kingston was planning, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The helicopter's descent onto Westbridge Academy's manicured lawn felt entirely different to Jason this time. Yesterday, he had been marched off these grounds in disgrace. Today, he returned alongside one of the most powerful men in the country, watching through the reinforced glass as students and teachers poured out of the buildings below, their upturned faces registering shock and confusion. "They look like ants from up here," Jason murmured, the observation slipping out before he could stop it. Kingston glanced at him, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Perspective changes everything, doesn't it? As the helicopter settled onto the grass, Jason's stomach tightened. Through the window, he could see Principal Carter pushing through the crowd, his face contorted with the effort to appear authoritative while clearly panicking. Several board members had also appeared, hastily summoned by frantic calls from the administration. "Are you nervous?" Kingston asked, his voice calm amid the fading roar of the engines. Jason nodded, unable to lie. "Terrified." "Good. Fear keeps us sharp." Kingston adjusted his cufflinks, a small gesture that somehow conveyed absolute control. "Remember, you're not here to beg for reinstatement. You're here to witness justice." The door swung open, and Kingston stepped out first, the afternoon sunlight gleaming off his silver hair. Jason followed, intensely aware of hundreds of eyes tracking his every movement. He spotted Mason and his friends near the front of the crowd, their expressions oscillating between disbelief and disdain. Principal Carter stepped forward, extending his hand with a strained smile. "Mr. Kingston, what an unexpected honor. Had we known you were coming?" Kingston ignored the outstretched hand, his gaze coolly assessing. "Principal Carter, I believe you've already met Jason Miller." Carter's eyes flicked to Jason, a flash of irritation crossing his features before being quickly masked. "Yes, of course. Mr. Miller's situation is unfortunate, but I assure you, all proper protocols were." "I'm not interested in your protocols," Kingston interrupted, his voice carrying effortlessly across the lawn. "I'm interested in your prejudice." A ripple passed through the crowd. Several teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while students shifted restlessly, sensing the tension. "Prejudice is a serious accusation," Carter replied, his smile hardening. "Westbridge Academy has a responsibility to maintain certain standards." "Standards," Kingston repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. He turned slightly, addressing the gathered crowd rather than just the principal. "Let's discuss standards, shall we?" He nodded to one of his assistants, who stepped forward with a tablet. "Jason Miller, perfect 4.0 GPA, ranked first in his class, scored in the 99th percentile on standardized testing. Note disciplinary infractions." The assistant looked up. "These are verifiable facts." Principal Carter cleared his throat. "Academic performance is just one factor we consider." "What were the other factors in Jason's case?" Kingston asked, his tone deceptively conversational. "His address? His father's occupation? The fact that his hands sometimes carry the honest dirt of agricultural labor." Students began to whisper among themselves, some nodding in recognition of the injustice being laid bare. "Mr. Kingston," one of the board members interjected, stepping forward with forced confidence. "While we appreciate your concern, this is an internal matter for Westbridge Academy. Our admissions and retention policies are carefully crafted to perpetuate class division and arbitrary social hierarchies." Kingston finished for him. "Yes, I've reviewed your policies." Fascinating reading. The board member blanched. "You've what?" Kingston's assistant held up the tablet again. "Westbridge Academy has expelled 23 students in the past 5 years. 21 were from lower-income families. 18 were scholarship students. None were children of major donors." A murmur ran through the crowd. Even some of the teachers looked disturbed by these statistics. "Correlation doesn't imply causation," Principal Carter protested, though his voice had lost its authority. "True," Kingston agreed with unexpected mildness. "So let's discuss causation directly." He turned to Jason. Would you share with everyone exactly what Principal Carter told you when he expelled you? All eyes shifted to Jason. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at Kingston, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. He said, Jason began, his voice initially soft before finding its strength, that this school is for students from respectable families. That farm boys like me don't belong here. That I lower the standard. The words hung in the air, damning in their simplicity. Several teachers looked down, unable to meet Jason's gaze. Even Mason seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another. Principal Carter's face flushed. That's the gross mischaracterization of a private conversation. Is it? Kingston asked. He nodded to his second assistant, who tapped something on his phone. Principal Carter's voice suddenly filled the air, crystal clear from hidden speakers. This institution is for students with real potential from respectable families, not for farm boys. The color drained from Carter's face. You recorded. My assistants record all my interactions, Kingston said smoothly. A necessary business practice. I happened to be on a call with Jason's father when you delivered your verdict. The lie was delivered so convincingly that even Jason almost believed it. The recording had likely been obtained through other means. Kingston's resources were clearly extensive, but the effect was devastating. This is highly irregular, one of the board members stammered, looking increasingly distressed. Indeed, Kingston agreed. So, is expelling your top student because of his socioeconomic background. He turned to address the entire assembly, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Westbridge Academy presents itself as an institution of excellence. Yet excellence cannot exist without equity. True merit recognizes no social boundaries, no arbitrary distinctions of birth or wealth. Students were nodding now, some openly, others more cautiously. Even a few teachers seemed moved by his words. Kingston continued, I came here today not just for Jason Miller, but for every student who has ever been made to feel unworthy because of circumstances beyond their control. He turned back to Principal Carter and the board members, his expression hardening. Now to business. I propose a donation to Westbridge Academy. The sudden shift caught everyone by surprise. The board members exchanged glances, financial interest momentarily overriding their discomfort. A donation? The head of the board asked cautiously. $10 million, Kingston stated. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $10 million was more than the school's annual operating budget. That's extremely generous, the board head managed, visibly struggling to process the figure. It comes with one condition, Kingston continued, his voice level. Jason Miller is to be reinstated immediately, with a formal apology from the administration. Additionally, Westbridge will establish a merit-based scholarship program for students from agricultural backgrounds, to be named after Benjamin Miller. Jason's head snapped up in surprise. His father's name? He hadn't expected that. Principal Carter's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. Mr. Kingston, while we appreciate your generosity, such decisions require proper board deliberation and— You have 30 seconds to decide, Kingston said, checking his watch. After which, the offer expires. And I take my concerns, and that recording, to the Department of Education, the press, and social media. The threat hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Board members huddled together, urgent whispers flying back and forth. Students watched in fascination as the adults who had always wielded unquestioned authority now squirmed under Kingston's implacable gaze. 20 seconds, Kingston noted calmly. Principal Carter broke from a group, his face a mask of forced pleasantness. There's no need for such haste, Mr. Kingston. Of course we accept your generous offer. Jason is welcome to return to Westbridge immediately. And the apology? Kingston prompted. Carter's smile tightened painfully. I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding, Jason. Your academic achievements are commendable, and we regret any impression that your background factored into administrative decisions. The apology was weak, grudging, and transparently insincere. but it was delivered publicly in front of the entire school, a humiliation Carter would never forget. Kingston nodded once, seemingly satisfied. My legal team will draft the donation agreement. I expect it signed by tomorrow. The victory should have felt sweeter. Jason had been vindicated, his expulsion reversed, his worth acknowledged. Yet as he stood there, feeling the calculating gazes of students who had ignored or mocked him just yesterday, something felt hollow about simply returning to Westbridge. As if reading his thoughts, Kingston placed a hand on his shoulder. "The choice is yours, Jason," he said quietly, for his ears alone. "You can return here, or you can come with me and learn how to change the system entirely." Jason looked around at the school that had rejected him, at the principal who had humiliated him, at the students who were now reassessing his value based solely on his connection to Kingston. In that moment, his decision crystallized with perfect clarity. The helicopter lifted off from Westbridge Academy's lawn, leaving behind a crowd of stunned faces growing smaller by the second. Jason watched through the window as his former school diminished beneath him, the grand buildings and manicured grounds shrinking until they resembled nothing more than an architect's model. "Second thoughts?" Kingston asked, studying Jason's expression. "No," Jason replied, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Just processing." 20 minutes ago, he had stood before Principal Carter and the entire school, the center of a drama he never could have imagined. When Kingston had presented him with the choice, return to Westbridge vindicated or leave for something unknown, the decision had formed in his mind with startling clarity. "I appreciate the reinstatement," Jason had told Principal Carter, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "but I've realized Westbridge isn't where I belong after all." The principal's face had registered shock, then barely concealed relief. But it was the reactions of his classmates that lingered in Jason's memory now, especially Mason, whose expression had transformed from smug superiority to confusion to something approaching respect. "Your father seems surprised by your decision," Kingston observed, interrupting Jason's thoughts. The helicopter had returned briefly to the Miller farm after leaving Westbridge, giving Jason time to explain his choice and gather more belongings. His father had listened quietly, his weathered face unreadable until Jason finished speaking. "He understands," Jason said, remembering the moment his father had pulled him into a fierce embrace. "You'll face different challenges," Benjamin Miller had whispered, "but you'll face them on your own terms." Kingston nodded, seemingly satisfied. "The scholarship program bearing your father's name will ensure other students from agricultural backgrounds have opportunities at Westbridge. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in returning to a place that rejected you, but in changing it from the outside." The helicopter banked gently, revealing the sprawling cityscape ahead. Skyscrapers rose like gleaming sentinels, their glass surfaces reflecting the late afternoon sun. At the center of the downtown district stood a building taller than the rest, its distinctive architecture unmistakable even from a distance. "Kingston Tower. That's where we're headed?" Jason asked, unable to keep the awe from his voice. "For now," Kingston replied. "My offices occupy the top 15 floors. The view helps with perspective." Jason studied the billionaire's profile, questions swirling in his mind. "Mr. Kingston, why me? Really? There must be thousands of students who face discrimination or unfair treatment. What made my situation different?" Kingston considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "3 reasons," he finally said. "First, your academic record suggests exceptional intelligence and work ethic, qualities I value. Second, your background in agriculture aligns with Kingston Enterprises' founding industry, where we still maintain significant interests." He paused, and Jason waited. "And the third reason? 17 years ago, your father made a suggestion about modifying our drought-resistant wheat formula. It was a small change, something our scientists might have eventually discovered themselves. But they hadn't, and that small change increased crop yields by 23%. Kingston turned to face Jason directly. That modification became the foundation of our agricultural division's most successful product line, generating billions in revenue. Your father never sought credit or compensation beyond his modest salary. When I discovered you were his son, I saw an opportunity to balance that equation." Jason absorbed this revelation, pieces clicking into place. "He never told me. Most innovators don't recognize the value of their own insights," Kingston said. "That's why they need advocates." The helicopter began its descent toward the landing pad atop Kingston Tower. Jason's stomach tightened with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Kingston said, "your real education begins." The next hours passed in a blur. Jason was escorted through security protocols and executive elevators, introduced to assistants and department heads whose names he struggled to remember. The offices were a world removed from anything he had experienced. All glass and steel and quiet efficiency, people moving with purpose through spaces designed to impress and intimidate. By evening, he found himself standing in a corner office on the 87th floor, walls of windows offering a panoramic view of the city as it transitioned from day to night, lights flickering on across the urban landscape. "This will be your learning space," Kingston said, gesturing around the room equipped with state-of-the-art technology. Not a classroom in the traditional sense, but a laboratory for understanding how systems work and how to change them. Jason ran his fingers along the edge of a sleek desk. "I still don't fully understand what you're offering me." Kingston considered him for a moment. "What Westbridge Academy couldn't give you, even if you had stayed, was context. They teach facts, formulas, historical dates. What they don't teach is power, how it's acquired, how it's wielded, how it's transformed." He moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. "For the next year, you'll rotate through key divisions of Kingston Enterprises. 3 months in agricultural innovation, 3 in financial operations, 3 in strategic development, 3 in philanthropic initiatives." Jason's eyes widened. "A whole year. Consider it an apprenticeship," Kingston said. "You'll continue your formal education with private tutors, preparing for college applications, but your real learning will happen in the field. You'll see how decisions made in boardrooms affect communities like yours, how policy shapes opportunity, how money flows through systems." He turned back to face Jason. "At the end of that year, if you've demonstrated the potential I believe you have, you'll be offered a full scholarship to any university you choose, plus a position at Kingston Enterprises that will accommodate your studies." The magnitude of the opportunity stole Jason's breath. This wasn't just about revenge against Westbridge or even about his own education. It was about transformation, about understanding the very structures that had been used to exclude people like him. "Why would you invest so much in someone you barely know?" Jason asked, the question that had been nagging at him since the helicopter first landed on his family's farm. Kingston's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Because 17 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. A farm boy with good grades and dirty hands, told I didn't belong in spaces reserved for better people." He moved to a small bar in the corner, pouring 2 glasses of water. "The difference was someone saw me, really saw me. A professor who recognized potential where others saw only background." He handed 1 glass to Jason. "He changed my life by giving me context, helping me understand not just how to succeed within the system, but how to reimagine it." Jason accepted the water, the cool glass grounding him in a moment that still felt surreal. "And now you're doing the same for me." Paying it forward, Kingston agreed. With interest. Outside the windows, the city continued its transition to night, a constellation of human-made stars spreading across the darkness. Somewhere out there was Westbridge Academy, where students were undoubtedly still buzzing about the day's events. Somewhere further was his family's farm, where his parents were probably sitting at the kitchen table, wondering about their son's future. "There will be challenges," Kingston warned. "People who resent your presence. Systems resistant to change. Your own doubts about whether you belong." "I'm used to that," Jason said with a hint of a smile. "Yes," Kingston acknowledged, "but the stakes will be higher, and so will the rewards." He extended his hand. "Are you ready to begin?" Jason looked at the offered hand, a gesture of partnership rather than charity. In that moment, he thought of Principal Carter's dismissive words, of Mason's sneers, of all the times he'd been made to feel that his background was a limitation rather than a foundation. He grasped Kingston's hand firmly. "I'm ready." As they shook hands, the city lights seemed to burn brighter beyond the windows, a fitting backdrop to a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Jason Miller, farm boy, top student, and now apprenticed to one of the most powerful men in the country, stood at the threshold of a future he could barely imagine. The helicopter ride that morning hadn't just carried him from his family's farm to Westbridge Academy and then to Kingston Tower. It had transported him across boundaries more significant than mere distance, boundaries of opportunity, of perception, of possibility. And as he stood in that gleaming office, the weight of yesterday's humiliation finally lifting from his shoulders, Jason understood that Kingston had given him something far more valuable than revenge or even vindication. He had given him perspective.